This will be your chance to take notes on the scientific method, which is the main topic for Unit 1. First thing that we always talk about during the scientific method is the idea of observations. All science starts with observation. Observation is pretty simple. It's anything that you take in using your senses, any information you can gather with sight, taste, smell, sound, or feel. However, we also use tools to enhance our senses and our ability to observe things. Some things are just too small, and sometimes we can't be as precise as we want to without using those tools to enhance our ability to observe. So, we have a question here, and see if we can pair these correctly. It says, which tool is correctly paired with the observation it measures? A thermometer in weight. B, a triple beam valence in volume. C, a meter stick in size. Or D, a graduated cylinder in volume. So if we take a look at this, the correct answer is the graduated cylinder in volume. A and B are both mislabeled for what they measure, and C is actually very important to know the difference between size and something like length. Size is difficult to measure because it's not a specific measurement, whereas perhaps length could have been correct. An inference is simply taking the observations you've made and then applying your own knowledge and experience of that subject. For instance, the dog is growling is an observation. The inference you can draw from that is that the dog is angry. You understand that angry dogs growl, so seeing the growling dog, you know from your experience that the dog's potentially angry. So if we look at a second example here, the tire has a leak. That's an example of an inference. Okay, you don't know whether or not the tire has a leak. It could have been manually deflated. Somebody could have wanted to take the air out of it, whatever. However, if we look at this on the other side, saying the tire is flat is an observation. We can see that there is less air in the tire than there's supposed to be. So again, we have another question here. Which statement is an inference? A, the plant is green. B, the plant is 17.5 centimeters tall. C, the plant is wilted due to lack of water. Or D, the plant weighs 300 grams. The correct answer here is C. The plant is wilted due to lack of water. The idea of including the lack of water is using your own information, your own knowledge, to make an inference. A, B, and D are all examples of observations made about the plant. Once your observations have been made, you'll have some sort of a problem that you want to solve. And the first step to solving that problem after you define it is to write a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is a statement that's going to explain what you expect to see. The best way to write a hypothesis is using an if-then statement, what's known as a conditional statement. So if this happens, then this should happen. By using that, it will meet all the criteria that the hypothesis really needs to meet. One is that it's a statement. It should not be a question. It should not start with I think or I wonder. It should be just a statement of what you believe will happen. Second thing is it needs to be testable. Can we actually do this? So if you do the if part, will the then part happen? And lastly, it needs to contain both the independent and dependent variable. Those two things are going to be found in the if and then statements, and it's going to show how they connect to each other. Again, we have a question here. Which statement represents a hypothesis? A, I think the plant will grow taller with more water. B, if the plant is given more water, then it will grow taller. C, will the plant grow taller with more water? Or D, water makes plants grow. And we see that B is the correct answer here. If the plant is given more water, then it will grow taller. We have our if-then statement. It has both our variables, and we can test this by giving a plant more water and seeing what the height is when it grows. Next thing that is important in any experiment is setting forth your procedure. Basically, what are you going to do in your experiment? These need to be very specific because the idea of any good science is that it's reproducible, which means somebody else can do your experiment and get the same results. That makes your experiment more valid, and you get results you can rely on better. So, as you're writing through the steps of your experiment, make sure to include specific details such as measurements, different temperatures, or the other surrounding environment, whatever that is. You need to make sure it's very specific so that someone doing your experiment does exactly what you did in your experiment. This also will lend the hypothesis to eventually become what's known as a theory. The idea is that if a hypothesis is shown to be right over and over and over again, then that hypothesis can become a theory and kind of accepted as generally true because there's no evidence to disagree with it. In designing your experiment, you also need to make sure you know what variables are being used. And so we need to identify some of these variables. The independent variable is the variable that you change as the experimenter. You set this one up so you can control it. Okay, so the independent variable is also called the manipulated variable. It's the thing that you are going to, as the experimenter, set up for your experiment. The dependent variable is always going to be measured. That's your data. So at the end of your experiment, all that data you collect, that will be your dependent variable. The other types of variables that are important to know about are what are called control variables. These are things that could potentially change, but you keep constant for sake of comparison. You don't want to change too many things because if you do, you won't know if your experiment is giving you the results that you were hoping for. So with your control variables, you have to keep all of them constant because you can only have one independent variable per experiment. The other thing we have are groups. Your experimental group is the subjects or the, whether it is people, plants, animals, that you're testing something on. They are going to get whatever your experimental treatment is. Your control group is going to have the normal conditions. And the idea of having a control group is that you can use that to compare to the results from the experimental group. The control group is how it always used to exist or how it's supposed to exist, whereas the experimental group is how you've changed it, and we see what the difference is. And you can compare those two and come up with a conclusion. So if we have here another question, using the following hypothesis as a reference, select the two control variables. It says, if more water is given to a plant, then the plant will grow taller. So our choices are soil type, amount of water, height of the plant, and type of the plant. And our correct answers here for our control variables are soil type and type of plant. They're variables that we could have changed, but we want to keep the same. Amount of water in this example is our independent variable, and height of the plant is our dependent variable. Those are things that we either are going to manipulate or can't control because we're going to measure them. After you've run your experiment, you're going to have data. That's going to be what you collect from your dependent variable. The data needs to be in some way measurable. Typically, we say, something like height or weight instead of something like size. Size is just kind of a general idea, whereas height and weight are specific measurable pieces of data. After you collect your data, you typically want to summarize and analyze it. And one of the best ways to do this, especially with numerical data, is by making a graph. And we'll talk about graphing over and over again throughout the year, but making a graph is one of the best ways to take your data and organize it so you can see trends and any changes that occur. Lastly, you need to have your conclusion. And there's really two main parts to a conclusion: stating whether or not your hypothesis was correct and explaining why you believe it was correct or incorrect using the data that you've analyzed from your experiment. So, for example, you would say the data supports or rejects your hypothesis because, and then go on to give evidence from your data. So in conclusion, the main steps of your scientific method are this. 1, to state the problem or ask a question. 2, to form a hypothesis. 3, to design and run your experiment. 4, to collect that data. And then 5, to draw your conclusions by analyzing your data and seeing whether that supports or rejects the hypothesis.